Okay, on to another unit. Aren't you so excited? And this picture right here must really get you excited because that means we're going to be talking about graphs, your favorite thing in the entire world. No, they may not be your favorite thing. You may despise graphs actually, but they're so important for you to understand. Even as an adult, I realize how much I need to be able to A, interpret a graph or interpret information, and then also make it easy for other people to understand. That's what graphs and tables are for, okay? But before we get into that, I want you guys to think about organization. Now, does this picture represent more of what you're like, or does this picture represent more of what you're like? Some of you guys might say, you know, this looks like me, especially when I'm trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do at Insight, right? And you're just kind of bombarded with all this information. You don't know what to do with it, so you throw it here, you throw it there, or you have all this information and it has its place, and you put it here and you put it here and you organize by colors and it's alphabetical order, okay? So probably many of us can't say that we're this, but hopefully we can strive to be a little bit more towards the organization period. You know, the organization is key for understanding what's going on in anything, whether it's science, it's math, or it's life, okay? Organization is very important. Well, we want to think about that when we're talking about the information we get from maybe an experiment. How do we organize the data that we actually get from something, okay? So let's talk about graphs and graphs and graphs and graphs and more graphs, right? So there's many different types of graphs. The first ones that you're going to see in your unit is you're going to see a line graph. So typically when you see a line graph, you'll see different points and you'll see a line connecting them, okay? And obviously you can see that it's talking about the year here on the x-axis and pounds eaten per person. How much turkey do people eat? It's kind of gross, right? So in 1975, on average, each person would eat 8 pounds of turkey. But then you go to the year 2000, which is still 13 years ago, and now we're up to 18 pounds of turkey per person. That's kind of gross. Think about it, 18 pounds. But nonetheless, this line graph is showing us something very specific, how things have changed over the year, okay? Another type of graph is a bar graph. So one right here, you'll notice that there's many different things, and it's hard to read because it's really small, but age in years, and then percentage of age group. And we're talking about use of dentists by young people in a year, okay? And it's showing different things, and you can see there's a key over here, but this bar graph is again organizing data into something that we can more visually see and understand, as opposed to just throwing this information out in a bunch of words and numbers, right? We want to have something a little bit more easily read and friendly to read, okay? Now, you always have a y-axis or an xy axis. You're going to have that here in the bar graph. You're going to have that in the line graph. But you also have another type of graph that typically you'll see in math, which you'll use these a lot. You're plotting points, okay? You have an x and a y axis, okay? And typically over here in this quadrant, you're going to have positive, positive, right? Your x coordinates are going to be positive and your y coordinates are going to be positive. Over here, you might have your x coordinates as negative and your y is positive, and so forth in each of the quadrants. This is typically a graph that's used in math, okay? Again, easily kind of a way to organize that math data that you gather, okay? The ones that we're going to be using a lot in science will be your line graphs and your bar graphs. Sometimes a pie graph, sometimes other things, but typically those are the ones that you're going to see. Now when we talk about constructing these, because I will have you guys work on constructing graphs because you need to know how to construct them. But first thing you need to organize your information, right? That's the first and foremost. Pick out what information is important and make a table to better organize it. Now it doesn't have to be a table, but you can come up with a table to organize your information. You can come up with a bar graph. You can come up with a line graph. But you have to pick out what is important out of that information and then organize it. Once you have your info in a table, then it's easier to figure out which graph you want to use. So typically, the first thing you might do is put your information all in a table, okay, which you can construct very easily in Word or in Excel, but it's an easy way to kind of lay out your information, but then you can pick out what graph you're going to use, okay? Now, if you can bypass the table and you can really look past that, I don't always require a table first. Sometimes I use a table in replace of a graph if that's easily organized that way. But sometimes you need a graph to see what you're kind of looking at. So it's sometimes nice to have a table first and you have that organization pattern already set, and then you can put that information into a graph, okay? So then you have to think about, which graph am I going to use? I don't know. Well, are you going to use a bar graph? Because a bar graph you would use when you need to show comparisons between categories. So remember a little bit back, we looked at that bar graph that had 3 different categories. They were all color-coded, and you had a key. That's the best way to show comparisons, right? Because you can show these color-coded bars that compare from year to year, or from, person to person, whatever you're comparing. So that's when you would choose to use a bar graph, when you're comparing between categories. Remember that, comparing between categories. You're going to use a bar graph. You're going to use a line graph when your data involves measurements that are related or vary with each other. Okay, so when you're measuring something, maybe you're measuring the temperature of the water in the summertime from 9 a.m. to noon, and every hour you're going to measure that water, okay? And you're going to measure that temperature, and that would be something you would plot on a line graph. And then you can show that as the time goes by, your water probably heats up in the summertime, okay? So that is something that you'd use a line graph when it involves measurements that are related or vary slightly with each other, okay? So line or bar graph, think about those two. And then obviously the components of the graph are really important. You have to have these in a graph. If you leave any of these out, you could be counted off wrong, especially when we're talking about TCAPs and taking those state assessments. Those you absolutely have to have all of the components of the graph. You need a title. If you don't have a title, you don't know what you're talking about, right? You got to figure out, what is this data saying and what are we trying to show here? Okay, that's the title. Your X and Y axis have to be labeled clearly with details. You can't just say time, because time could be in hours and minutes. You have to say time in minutes, okay? Or weight in pounds. So it has to be clearly labeled with details. So make sure those 2 components are absolutely part of your graphs. Right? Right. So let's take a quick look at 2 graphs that are in your unit. So this is in your lesson. So it's saying choosing the best graph activity. And hopefully you guys go through this, and maybe you already have. But you're looking at these 2 data tables, and it says, using the activity below, decide on the best graph for the given types of data. For each of the following, decide if a line graph or a bar graph should be used to represent the data. So here we have elevation in meters, and we have number of pine trees per hectare, okay? So that's talking about kind of a distance. So which would you guys think we would use? Okay, we're talking about the elevation versus the number of pine trees, okay? And we're looking at measurements, okay? So maybe we might be thinking, okay? You would use a line graph. So hopefully you guys already kind of thought of that the fact that we're talking about measurements of something in particular, that the best thing would be to use a line graph. And if you go down here a little bit, your data table 2 says type of animal, polar bear, goat, cat, fish, cockroach, average number of offspring per year. Well, this would be hard to plot as a line graph, right? Because you have all these different types of animals. We're comparing, right? Keyword, comparing. So bar graph or line graph? Yes, bar graph. You're correct if you said that. So a bar graph would be great for data table 2 because you're comparing something, okay? All right, back to our little PowerPoint now. Patterns and trends, another thing to keep in mind. What do you notice, and why is that information important? That's something why we do these graphs as well, is we want to figure out what are the patterns and trends so that we can maybe predict for the future, which we'll talk about next. But in this case, this is actually a picture from your lesson, the amount of nitrogen in water, okay, and then the nitrogen in water here, distance from sewage treatment plant in kilometers. We're plotting these points, and we're noticing that there's a downward trend, right? So the distance is actually increasing, okay, and the nitrogen in water is actually decreasing as you go pretty much further. Further from the plant, there's going to be less nitrogen in the water, okay? So we're noticing that trend, which can help you and help scientists figure out what to do with maybe a particular problem. So that is something very important to realize, is the pattern and trends that go on with these different types of graphs that you're going to be using. Okay, so take note of what's happening. Okay, this will help you draw your conclusions. So when you're figuring out what your conclusions are for your particular lab or experiment, drawing or looking at those patterns and trends are going to help you draw your conclusions better. What are you observing? What's being tested? Okay, what are we graphing, and what's happening there, so that we can figure out what to do next, if that's the case, okay? So patterns and trends are huge. The last thing we're going to talk about is interpolation and extrapolation. So these are found in your lesson as well. Don't get worried by the big, huge words you're seeing because it's actually pretty easy. Interpolation is an estimate or probable guess of a value between two known values. So say you have this graph right here. It's kind of a line graph. You've measured point A and you've measured point B. But you want to know maybe something that's going on in here. What's the measurement of something that maybe you haven't measured it, but because you know this point and you know this point, it's pretty easy to deduct what might happen. If you draw a line through those points, you know that your point C, which is interpolated C, is going to fall along that line. So it's easy to kind of figure out and guesstimate what that value is going to be. Okay, so basically interpolation is you know this point and you know this point and you want to find something in between, right about there. Okay, now extrapolation is estimating extending beyond what you already know. So here's again Brian's height chart. Okay, here is his ages down here on the x-axis, and on the y-axis you have his height. So you have all these different points plotted that they've taken his height. But you want to know just maybe how tall he might be at age 30. So when you take this line and you extend it out, you can figure out what is that point going to be. It's going to be a guesstimate, remember, it's not going to be for sure. But you might figure out, okay, he's going to be 10 feet tall. Okay, not really, obviously. At some point he'll stop growing because at age 30 he has discontinued his growth by then. But nonetheless, you can figure out something that's going to happen in the future. So that's extrapolation, estimating by extending beyond the known information. So again, only you can do these with line graphs. You can't do this with a bar graph. But line graphs you can do, and you can basically figure out what's beyond that point, okay, what's beyond these points, and you can guesstimate. So that's interpolation and extrapolation. So hopefully you guys have a better understanding of what that means by just seeing some visuals. Bada bing, bada boom, we're done. Short and sweet, and we'll see you again for another lesson.